to computer. Okay, go
All
ahead,
right.
Ken.
Well,
Let's
thank
do
you
it.
guys. Thank you guys for joining us. I always look forward to these. It's fun. We always get to talk about these very specific and often controversial topics, which are my favorite. I tend to specialize in those. Um, the talk today is based on an article I wrote for ACSH back in April called "The Science Subsidy Trap," and it makes the case that we need to completely eliminate federal science funding, which I'll say from the outset is controversial. It's a minority opinion. I was called crazy at least 5 times in the last month as a result of this story. so, so I'll forewarn you from the outset. This is a counter consensus position I'm taking, but nonetheless, I think it's well supported by the literature that's out there, especially in economics, which is a field many scientists, in my experience, tend to neglect and they don't pay attention to. But um, the reason I decided to write about this is if you think back to the Trump administration coming into power for the second time in January, very quickly we saw this Doge campaign take off headed by Elon Musk, and we saw announcements that the administration was significantly cutting federal funding to institutions like NIH, Health and Human Services, and all the various sub agencies that dole out a lot of federal grant funding. And the reaction from the science community uniformly was this is the destruction of our future. You're going to cripple our economy. We're going to lose to China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was one article after another in Science and Nature and Scientific American. They all basically made this case. And here I'll quote Scientific American. They say the administration's funding cuts imperil the nation's health, economy, and national security. And they're sort of working on this assumption that science funding is a public good. It just is because it is. We need public science funding because we need science. Okay, well, we need science. Why do we need public science funding? Well, because public science funding is how you get science. Like these two things, in the thinking of most people, they're intimately connected in a way that they can't be separated. And I don't think that's true. The bigger problem with the case that we've seen from these academic journals is that they're neglecting the real concerns that are ongoing within science. So, Tom and I were speaking about this before everyone showed up, but there's a wide swath of fraudulent research and ideological corruption within scientific institutions. We're going to talk about some examples today and some research. And within the context of science funding, the academic world doesn't want to talk about this. So when there's a major case of fraud, they will poo-poo it and they will say, we this is bad and it hurts our field and blah blah blah. But when it comes to actually addressing the fraud, no one ever really wants to talk about um, one of the obvious solutions, which is to stop paying people to do fraudulent and ideological research, because of course it threatens everyone's funding and nobody likes that. Um, but I'm going to make the case that the Trump administration hasn't gone far enough, right? They don't just need to cut fat around the edges. They don't need to find particularly egregious examples like, funding Sesame Street in Iraq and, these various programs that were part of USAID that people objected to, right? Those are good. I don't think those should exist, but we need to completely eliminate the federal science budget. And here's why. This is a pretty simple case. We spend about $160 billion dollars every year as collectively as taxpayers on science funding. And what we're told is that, this is gonna take us further into outer space. We're gonna develop these really cool technologies. This is how we get new vaccine candidates and new treatments for cancer. And right, this is what drives our progress as a nation. And again, not only is that not true historically, as I'll describe, but it totally neglects, as I said, the fraud and the ideological corruption. So I really want to dig into these issues um, and make the case. And we're going to go through those 3 points that I mentioned in some depth. And then afterwards, I want to address some common criticisms that come up. And then if you have questions or observations, I'd love to finish up with a back and forth as we typically do. So here's the first problem. The problem of fraud. I think this is the most unobjectionable part of my presentation today. And I want to start with a particularly egregious example. So there's a neuropathologist at the National Institute on Aging, or at least he was. He's on administrative leave right now, I think. I don't know what the end result of his case is going to be, but his name is Eliezer Maslia. He's a very well-known researcher in the field of neurodegenerative disorders. Um, And it came out in 2022. Science reported they did an investigation into this that I believe it was a dozen, maybe more of his studies that he contributed to contain duplicated images. And these were over the course of many years. And it wasn't just that the research was likely fraudulent, it was that the research became the justification for clinical trials for drugs for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So he had fabricated this research, which then incentivized the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in FDA clinical trials, excuse me, for these drugs. Now the trials are ongoing, and the companies that are sponsoring them are saying, there may still be some value in these. Obviously, they're, probably hesitant to cut off their loss in this case. But nevertheless, you have a major federal official, widely respected in the field, who's doing fraudulent work. And science spoke to some other experts. They asked these experts to review the case and look at the evidence against this guy, and they said, we're floored. I mean, this is years of fraud going on. Now, if you compare this gentleman to someone like the woman who ran Theranos, right? She made fraudulent claims about what their testing technology could do. She's in federal prison right now, right? She's in prison for lying to her investors, so it's investment fraud. It's not science fraud, but they were a technology-based company, and she lied about the results of their work, and right, she's behind bars now. And I think that speaks to an interesting point about how the market and how governments react to corruption within the private sector, within the marketplace. So that's another point we can come back to. But there's other examples. Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard last year, they were forced to retract 7 papers that contained duplicated images. And of course, Dana-Farber, very reputable. They get lots of federal grant funding. But nevertheless, they're doing outright fraudulent work. Um, and it's not just these examples. One of the objections that I got to my story, and that always comes up when we talk about this issue, is that these are a few bad apples, right? Like most people are doing good work, and these cases are unfortunate, but they don't represent the majority of scientists. And, fair enough, we can say that, but there's been people looking at this replication crisis, as it's called in science. So last year in February, there's a team of data researchers at Northwestern University. They called the replication crisis existential. So that's not my phrasing, right? These are people that have developed machine learning techniques to identify papers that are unlikely to replicate because there are certain patterns you can detect like falsified images or the kind of language they use and so forth that you can use to detect studies that aren't going to replicate. They're not all fraud. Don't get me wrong, but there's ways to detect studies that are bad, that aren't going to go anywhere. So they called it an existential crisis. There's been multiple studies published looking at research in psychology and biomedicine. It's something like 50% of published papers don't replicate. In 2015, PLOS Biology put out an analysis looking at all of the research that's been done looking at replication. And they found, this is a direct quote, with government sources providing the majority of funding, they found that irreproducible preclinical research costs $28 billion annually in the US alone. Now, that's a decade ago. The problem has no doubt gotten larger. And one of the reasons we know this is that recently the Wall Street Journal reported that Wiley, which is one of the behemoth academic publishers alongside Springer Nature, they had to shutter 19 journals because those 19 journals had published 11,000 studies that were junk. 11,000 studies over just 2 years. So some are fraud, some are just nonsense. They're, just a waste of time and money. But the point here is this isn't just a few bad apples. This isn't a problem on the fringes of the scientific establishment. We have major institutions at the heart of this, and there's a lot of it going on, right? So these are symptoms of a system that doesn't work. And I want to quote evolutionary biologist Colin Wright. He's come to prominence as a critic of the gender medicine, revolution, whatever you want to call it. I think the whole thing is absolutely wild as a father of 2 young children. But he pointed out in response to this Wall Street Journal article that the incentive structure of science journals and academia is not aligned with truth seeking. And I think he's 100% correct. It's aligned with getting as many papers published as you can. This is, as you probably well know, is called the publish or perish paradigm, where if you're an academic researcher, you have to get grants, you have to publish papers, and then you have to get more grants to publish more papers. And that's created an incentive system where people are pressured to publish stuff that's either low quality or even fraudulent. And I've heard more than one academic scientist tell me, we're really under pressure, and so we have to get papers out, and sometimes people cut corners to do it. And it's always sort of an implied justification. Of course, now if I did that, right, if I started writing articles for ACSH that were blatantly plagiarized, and you all came to me and said, "Hey, what are you doing? Right? This is not what you're here for. You're not here to take credit for other people's work." And I said, "Well, yeah, but I got a mortgage and, health insurance is really expensive and, I'm like really under the gun here." Tom would say, "Well, that's too bad. Have a nice life." Right? And I probably wouldn't be able to get any other work in science journalism because my reputation would be destroyed. So it's really interesting that when it comes to academic research, there's almost this sort of, give them a break. These poor guys are under the gun. And I don't like I understand that incentive structure needs to change, but that's not an excuse for fraudulent work. Um, Now, following up on Colin Wright's observation that academia isn't aligned with truth seeking, I think you can see this in the political and the ideological influence on science these days. Um, and here I want to talk about a term called tactical science. Roger Pilkey Jr. is a climate policy expert. He uses this term. And what he's talking about research that's oriented toward achieving a certain policy outcome or achieving a certain ideological goal. So these are studies, they're basically meant to give intellectual cover to a political campaign. And there's all sorts of examples of these. The one again that really is wild to me and that didn't get nearly as much attention as it should have is that um, in 2015, Health and Human Services did a review of gender transition surgery, and they did this because they had advocacy groups. They wanted Medicare and they wanted the insurance companies to cover the cost of these procedures for children. But in order for the government to authorize those kind of payments, they had to do a review of the science and see what the evidence said. Is this safe? Is it effective? What are the outcomes long term? And when they did the review, the first draft they put out was extensive. It was 109 pages, I think. It was very well done. But one of the things that came out of it was that these procedures are not justifiable. We don't have long-term data. There's so few people that undergo them. We don't know the serious consequences of, do like radically altering the body of a young child. I mean, that's really unheard of until relatively recently. Now, the second draft they put out, because the first draft, government documents, as you probably know, they go out for public comment when an agency puts out a report or a policy position or some sort of a guidance. They put this out for public comment, and then they revised the draft in 2016. And the final draft had edited out systematically all of the details about the risks of these gender transition surgeries. And it's hard to know why, but what seems likely is it's because the government wanted evidence to justify supporting these kind of procedures. Now, this came out because of an investigation that was done by City Journal, which is a publication put out by the Manhattan Institute. They do pretty good work, but they're sort of a right of center policy think tank. They're not within the scientific establishment. They're not an academic journal. They're not a university. Like they're not at the heart of the medical complex or the medical establishment, whatever you want to call it. And the question that I've raised before is, why wasn't it the American Medical Association that was raising these concerns? Why wasn't it the American Academy of Pediatrics, right? The people who have the most interest in a topic like this, like allowing children to undergo totally untested surgeries that are going to alter them for the rest of their lives. Nobody discussed that. It was mind-boggling to me, right? It came from this policy think tank and it's good. I'm glad it came out, but within science, no one seems to care enough to do anything about that. It's ridiculous. Um, there's other examples too. So like during the COVID pandemic, I've written a lot about the lack of evidence supporting vaccine mandates, like at the national level. When you look at the research on vaccine mandates, what it shows is it actually discourages vaccine uptake, which of course is exactly the opposite of what you want during a pandemic because it plays on people's fears, it alienates them, and there's multiple studies from all over the world that show this. But nevertheless, what you heard from the science community over the last 5 years was you're going to get this vaccine or we're going to fire you, and your kids can't go to school, right? We're going to fundamentally alter your life unless you comply with this. And the literature on this clearly showed that that was a mistake. Same thing with the lockdowns. Maybe there was a case early on in the pandemic for sort of targeted um, lockdowns were like a particular part of the country, let's stay indoors, so we're limiting transmission of the virus. But over time, it was clear that the impacts of this were largely negative. The risks outweighed the benefits. And this today, I don't think is really controversial. It's mostly recognized, but it was clear at the time too. I mean, Alex Berezow, who my predecessor at ACSH, right, microbiologist, he very bravely, I think, he wrote very early in the pandemic that we don't have good justification for these kind of policies. And sure enough, he's been vindicated since. But at the time, very few people in science would say it because there was political pressure, mainly from the institutions that fund work in infectious disease, that had made it clear that this is the policy. And so the researchers got in line and they told the government what the government wanted to hear. And I know people don't like that broadly, but that's true. That's true. And you can see that when you look at the literature that was involved there. One final example before we move on here. You all remember RFK Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearing a couple months back before he became HHS secretary. You had these major senators, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, some of these other folks. They were grilling Kennedy on the strange things he believes, right? I mean, his anti-vaccine stance, his claims about cell phone radiation, his claims about fluoride. These are all really weird, unsubstantiated claims. And they were right to call him out publicly for that. But what no one called him out on, and what no one in the science community generally says, is that Kennedy usually cites research that's published in major journals. So when he was talking about the supposed effects of fluoride on IQ, he was quoting a study that was published just last year, I believe, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So the point I'm getting at here is that there is tons of academic research. It's low quality epidemiology. It's done for ideological reasons. And then someone like Kennedy comes along and he quotes it and he makes his sort of anti-science case. And everyone lectures him and they go, you're a lawyer, you're a shill. We don't believe anything you're saying. But then they won't look behind him and go, oh yeah, it's these guys at major universities that are doing these studies that you're quoting, right? So if people are truly concerned about the rhetoric that Kennedy is espousing and the policies now pushing that are truly alarming, I think he's up to no good in many ways. But there's a whole mountain of literature, of peer-reviewed science, and use that term loosely, that he quotes. So the academy, in other words, the funding institutions are supporting this work. So they fund this low grade science, and then Kennedy gets up and he goes, "We need to take fluoride out of the drinking water," and everyone goes, "Are you insane?" And of course, yeah, he is. I sure think he is. But the point is that he's got plenty of support in the academic literature, and nobody wants to talk about that. And that's one of the reasons that motivated the article that I wrote is that, look, let's cut off the funding stream to this bad science because people like Kennedy use it to push for harmful policy. They filed, nonsense lawsuits against pharma companies, against companies that haven't done anything wrong, because the literature is chock full of, junk studies about talc and, all these different topics that we've talked about. Um, Now, the most important thing probably that we need to talk about is that public funding for science doesn't yield the benefits that we've been told it does. Excuse me for one second. I'm talking too much. Goodness. Um, Now we know this for several reasons, and it goes back actually centuries. So I'm sure some of you have read Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. Now, what he says in that book, it's primarily economics, right? It's like that's one of the foundational texts for sort of a free market approach to economic policy. But he also talks about science funding in that book. And Terence Keeley highlights this in his book, The Economic Laws of Scientific Research. And what he points out about Smith is that Smith was deeply distrustful of politicians handling the public's money for special projects like scientific research. And he says these he calls these people vulgar statesmen or politicians. Typical challenges to the integrity of people in public office. But he also says that scientists become they become an interest group in effect, right? They get together and they end up colluding to protect their interests as stakeholders who receive public funding. Of course, this was in 1776. We're centuries in the future now. This is exactly what we're seeing, right? We're seeing major institutions, as I said at the top, the science journals, the academic organizations, they're all circling the wagons to say, don't take our funding because this is going to destroy the economy. Now, of course, it just happens that all of their livelihoods are contingent on that money continuing to come in, right? Uh, and this is the point that Smith was making, is that people who are public interest groups in this sense, they look out for their own interests. This is public choice theory in action. This is more economics. Um, let me read this to you. This is from Keeley's book. So he says Smith was very suspicious of interest groups who appealed for public money. Such appeals, and he quotes Adam Smith here, such appeals ought always to be listened to with great precaution and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. And I don't think that happens today, which is the problem, right? As I said, the starting assumption is public funding for science is good. Now you prove to me that I shouldn't get your money, right? It's completely backwards, is the point. Um, Now there's been some interesting research on this too. Again, this is mostly from the economics literature. Keeley cites it extensively in his book, but there's been other studies that have been done. And what's most important is that a lot of these are government audits of science funding. So, for example, in 2003, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, would basically the developed economies of the Western world, they looked at economic growth rates of 21 leading economies, and this was their result. And they were actually surprised by this. They said the negative results for public research and development are surprising. But they nonetheless went on to say, taken at face value, the results suggest publicly funded R&D crowds out private R&D. There's been many such studies that have reached this conclusion. In 2007, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics published a review of the literature on this, and they said the overall rate of return to R&D is very large. However, these returns apply only to privately financed research and development in industry. Now, the case that Keeley and other experts have made is that this is a crowding out effect, right? The government doesn't produce anything of value, right? It gets money from three ways. It either taxes us directly, it borrows money, or it prints money and inflates the currency, which is just another way of taxing the public. So as a result of this, it has to pull money out of the market and then invest it in whatever it's going to invest it in. Now, what this does is it sends a signal to people who would normally fund scientific or medical research that they don't have to because the government's already investing in that. So what happens a lot of the time is pharma companies, for example, they'll just go develop some other drug. Or if they're going to do like a collaborative, the public-private partnership kind of thing, they lower their investment in the research funding because the government is offsetting it. And so this is one of the major problems with public science funding is it creates an incentive. It literally physically takes money that otherwise people would have to invest in science. But it also incentivizes people to spend less. And this has been documented in multiple studies over the years. And again, this is typically not dealt with. As I was telling Tom before we started, right? There's a very narrow field of economics nerds that argue about this back and forth. Keeley's one of the more prominent ones. But within the science community at large, no one talks this way because everyone's incentive is to keep the money flowing. So nobody wants to have an honest conversation about why public science funding might have negative externalities like that. Um, Now, I keep saying, excuse me, I keep saying this is a key point. They're all really key points. But one of the central arguments that Keeley has made over the years is that private investment in practical technology is what drives scientific innovation. We have it exactly backwards today. So the story that everyone's told about this pipeline model, as it's called, is that the government invests money in basic or pure research. There's no particular goal in mind. They're just trying to discover new things. And as a result of that, you get new drug candidates. You find new ways to engineer a motor or something, and then the private sector commercializes that. And this is supposed to be the engine of our economic progress. Keeley points out, very helpfully, I think, that during the Industrial Revolution, or prior to the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, the United States and Great Britain invested almost nothing in science the way that we do today. There was no public, bureaucracy that funded scientific research. But the Industrial Revolution took off in England, in Great Britain, and then it followed not long after in the United States. Now, compared to France and Germany, which invested heavily in public science, they lagged significantly behind, right? So the Industrial Revolution, which really exploded living standards in now what we call the developed world, occurred despite almost no public science funding. That's really hard to explain if this pipeline model is essential to our economic development. And I still haven't heard a very good explanation of this from anyone on the other side of the debate. Um, and the mechanism here that Keely's talking about is that it's technologists that are trying to solve practical problems that develop new ways of doing things. And so he gives the example from textiles. There was a handful of developments that allowed people to process fabric much more efficiently with lower amounts of labor. And this is really a fundamental point in economics, right? What causes an increase in wealth? Well, it's increases in productivity that minimize labor and other inputs, right? So you can produce more for less. And if there's more goods and services available, by definition is a growing economy. And so it was that incentive, right? It was the owners of these factories or the managers of these factories, and sometimes it's actually the laborers themselves. They're trying to figure out new ways of processing these materials for clothing and other fabrics. And that, he says, Keeley says in his book, that presaged the Industrial Revolution. And so as a result of these technological developments, you learn about the natural world. Your understanding of science becomes deeper because you're developing new technologies along the way. So these things they go in parallel, right? It's not that one precedes the other; they go in parallel. But the incentives are really what drive people to invest in science. Um, Historically, we can see evidence of this, and this is where I want to turn to countering some criticism, right? So a lot of people will say the private sector won't fund science because companies are short-term minded, right? They're looking at the next quarter, they're looking at the next year, they're just trying to make the line on their stock value go up. They don't have the foresight of these benevolent geniuses in Washington, our overlords who care so much for us and never do anything corrupt or evil, right? That's why we have to give the feds authority over science funding because you can't trust the private sector to do this. This is nonsense, and in fact, you can look at major science outlets for evidence of this. So, in 2016, Nature was wrote an article. They're trying to explain to up and coming researchers how you're going to fund your work. Um, and what they said in this story, it's really fascinating what they'll admit when they're not thinking about it. This is a direct quote. They said, private funding was the main and often only support for scientific endeavors before the 1940s. Now, here's the context for that claim that they're making. So at the time, they were talking about a stagnation in federal funding for science that began in 2003. So Nature writes, the stagnation in federal funding has led to increasing concerns that science will suffer because more risky or preliminary projects are not likely to get funded. But then they go on to say money from private foundations can fill this financial gap to a degree. This is a really important admission. And again, this is not in the context of the current day where we're talking about major cuts, but it still illustrates the mechanism that I'm talking about, is that if there is a project that's funded publicly, if there's value in it, right? If it's a vaccine that will prevent infection, or if it's a CRISPR-based therapy that will correct someone's genes so they don't develop a serious disease, or whatever, if it's some sort of piece of technology that will make people's lives better, it gets funded because there's value in it, right? You don't need the public sector to fund stuff that's useful. You just don't. And this is what this quote from Nature illustrates. Now, here's another example. This is from a study that was published in 2022. Because, in fact, before the 1940s, before there was substantial federal funding, you had foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, which was built with Standard Oil money, right? It was the oil industry, ironically, that funded indirectly a bunch of the public health innovations that developed in the middle of the 20th century. So here's a quote from this study. At first, the Rockefeller Foundation focused on public health issues, particularly in Latin America, where they conducted surveys in many countries, followed by programs to eradicate diseases such as hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever. And the study goes on to note that they invested between 1913 and 1950 $100 million dollars in these various health programs. And of course, this is the direct quote from the study here. The foundation's main characteristic is that it sprang from and owes its considerable financial resources to American capitalism. Now, one of the pushbacks I got from a lot of people when I published the article, and including from some of my colleagues at ACSH, is that you can't count on the private sector to fund this kind of stuff. This is a direct contradiction to that, right? You have private money that not only for industrial reasons will finance research, but just for philanthropic reasons, right? Because they have money and they want to see some of these issues eradicated, right? Like infectious diseases, because people have a tendency to help those in need, but of course, it's contingent on you letting them have their money. Um, Final thing here before we wrap up, and then we can have a dialogue if you guys want to talk. People will say public science funding yielded X innovation, right? We wouldn't have the internet without public funding. We wouldn't have the Human Genome Project, or we wouldn't have COVID vaccines without the government guaranteeing purchases of the Pfizer shot and so forth. The problem I have with this argument is that it puts you in the position of having to present a counterfactual that you can't really verify. So, for example, if the government takes taxes money from me and then it helps put my kids through college, it can't turn around and say, "Well, we put your kids through college, right? So you have to give us your money because we put your kids through college." Now, of course, there's no way to show that I wouldn't have put my kids through college, right? If you let me keep more of my money, I have an incentive to educate my kids, to look out for their welfare, to provide for their needs. So in other words, if the government takes tax money and it puts some of it into useful programs, that doesn't mean the programs wouldn't exist otherwise, right? This is the sort of silly kind of Keynesian economic argument you get for any sort of public intervention, right? We have to spend money on this particular pet project or this particular piece of pork because it promotes job creation. And there's the multiplier effect when the government spends money, it boosts aggregate demand, and this is how the economy grows. Of course, that argument's silly for a variety of reasons. The inflationary effects of government spending. Of course, there's all kinds of distortions that are introduced into the economy that way. All kinds of harmful incentives are introduced. But nevertheless, when it comes to science, this is just an article of faith, right? The government puts money into science, and then we go to Mars, and we live in this brave new world, and it's going to be great. I don't think that's true. And then, of course, the peer competitor argument. China puts gazillions of dollars into scientific research, and they're gonna outpace us, and that's really alarming. I don't think that's true either, right? I mean, China for the longest time was a totalitarian communist society. I guess it technically still is, but their economic growth really accelerated when they embraced markets, albeit imperfectly, right? They allowed some degree of economic freedom, and their society started to develop as a result of that. You can see the same thing. There's the classic example. I don't know if you've seen the Google Earth image of North Korea and South Korea at night. At South Korea, there's bright light everywhere because they have a developed, advanced economy. North Korea is just completely dark. And of course, it's because it's a communist hellhole. And there's no freedom, there's no economic growth because no one has any incentive to do anything that we take for granted here in the West, like establishing a business or investing in a company or whatever. Those things don't exist in those kind of societies. So, in other words, the economies, the societies that develop are the ones that embrace a certain degree of freedom and economic liberalism. That's what drives the growth, right? So the fact that China pours billions of dollars into all sorts of public works projects doesn't prove anything. It proves that they waste money. They have developed a significant debt as well as the United States. They have their own trade deficits. And so that's not a very compelling argument. So as we wrap up here, the final point I would just make is no one's entitled to public funding. It really frustrates me that there are people, especially in the sciences, like not everyone is like this, but there's a lot of people within the academy. They have this very condescending view of everybody, right? I have my PhD, I'm here in my laboratory, and I'm smarter than you, and I understand what's good for you, and therefore I'm going to take your money and spend it on projects that I think are useful. And if you don't like it, well, that's too bad because I'm better than you. This is the implication. It's not always openly stated, but sometimes it is. And I want to try to share I want to try to share this picture with you guys. This is from a recent protest in
Able to
Washington.
share it? You need to share screen?
Yeah, I'm gonna share it
Okay.
if you'll give me permission.
I think I just did.
Okay, here it is. Okay, can you guys see that?
Not yet.
Okay,
It says multiple, so you should be able to.
okay,
There you go.
okay. How about now?
Watch the
Okay,
blanks
you see that
area.
sign right there? Okay, this is from a recent protest in Washington where you had all of these scientists get together to rally to defend their public funding. And this is the sort of signs you saw at these protests, right? Science keeps you a-holes alive. You know, so again, as I said, as a parent, I'm deeply concerned about this gender affirming care stuff. I think it's ridiculous. You have major scientific institutions endorsing all sorts of nonsense. You have the CDC saying that men can breastfeed. Just the level of absurdity that we've reached as a society, where you have science advocating for these totally evil, unjustifiable practices, and then the public objects to that and they say, we don't want to pay for this. And this is what the science community reacts with. We keep you a-holes alive. So give us your money, right? I think, and I don't mean to get outraged here, but that's the level of absurdity that we're talking about here. So I'll wrap it up there. But my fundamental point is there's widespread fraud in science, there's ideological corruption, and the benefits of public funding, they've just been wildly overblown. And as a result of this, I think we can eliminate it. So I'll stop there and then have at it. Fire questions and comments.
A couple things. First, China probably spends half as much on espionage as they do scientific research, because most of the ideas that they get, they steal from us. Um, and then the other thing is late 2024, somebody came out with a study that showed that more than half of all peer-reviewed articles that appeared in scientific journals in 2023 were retracted. These were peer-reviewed and still retracted. So scientists are looking at other scientists' work and approving it, but then somebody else says, no, that's wrong. And so, boom, they get pulled. So science doesn't necessarily do a really good job of checking itself. And the other thing is government-funded science doesn't take the risks that private sector scientists do. The private sector scientists will try something that's not been tried before, whereas when you're government funded, you kind of want to stay with what's been tried before. And so nothing really new and awe-inspiring comes out of government funded research.
That's the bureaucratic way.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's one view of it,
That's one what? I'm sorry.
one view
Okay.
of it, of bureaucracy. But I mean, what about the RNA vaccine? I mean, my understanding was that the basic research was government funded, and then it was taken on by the
No, the
pharmaceutical
original
companies.
research that was used for that was
The-
actually developed by Gilead
yeah.
Science for treatment of AIDS.
There's another researcher. She works at a university now. I'll look up her name in a second, but a lot of the basic work into RNA was done by her privately because she couldn't get grant funding for it. It's actually a fascinating story. So it was collaborative as the years went on. There was public funding into the mRNA platform for vaccines and other drugs. Um, but she ultimately left her university position and went into the private sector because she couldn't get public funding for the work. Now, once it was clear that it was going to be used for vaccines, and then particularly when COVID came along and it became the platform for the vaccines, everyone heralded it as this incredible technology, which it is. But no one wanted to say, oh, by the way, for like 30 years, we didn't want to give this woman money because we thought it was a waste of time, you know? So that's just one example of what I'm talking about. And I'll find the article. I think it was it Health Affairs? I don't know. I'll find the article and I'll post it for you guys. But it's fascinating. People will admit that this happened, but it never occurs to them, well, maybe we need to reevaluate the way we fund science if we're, as a community, we're unwilling to fund, this kind of risky mRNA research, which we now know works incredibly well.
And there was one government funded science project that had tremendous success. But that was because it was given both a goal and a deadline. When JFK, talking about NASA, said that we will put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the end of this decade. So they not only had a goal, they had a deadline. Because as one of my former donors used to say, a goal without a deadline is just a dream. And
You
so
could
that's
probably,
one of the problems that's not put into a lot of this study that's being done is give them so much time. If there's no success, scrap it and try another method. Whereas in government, it just needs more money and goes and goes and goes and goes. So that's
but you could probably say the same as putting the man on the moon as the atomic bomb, as
yes,
government did with a deadline.
yes, exactly. I forgot about I forget about the Manhattan Project because it's supposed to be secret. But you're right. There's actually two instances where, and now in war situations, there's always, but there's no deadline there. It
Yes.
has an end goal.
So what about the internet? I understood that the initial program of research was in the army or something, or
Mhm.
I don't know, was government.
It was DARPA,
And
It
then
was a DARPA project.
yes, it was.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Although
was
the
originally called,
National Science Foundation did set up a project between MIT and Stanford to let those two colleges communicate with each other.
Yeah, I thought it was a university-based thing, but maybe it was
Well,
they put them together. Hell, I don't know.
but the
DARPA subcontracted to the UCLA. The actual initial experiment was done at UCLA.
right, but
Yeah,
like I said, at the
okay.
same time, National Science
That
Foundation
was
was funding.
before Al Gore got involved and invented the whole thing, of course.
But National Science Foundation was funding something else to allow universities to speak with each other without having to use phone communications or anything like that. Although they did use digital communications through the phone. And then that developed into what was known as the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which was a private sector thing. And that exploded in 1990 and 1991. I went to a conference in San Francisco in 1991 that was talking about what implications this new internet would have for freedom and privacy. It's called Computers, Freedom, and Privacy. And it had all the big players back in the day, like Mitch Kapoor and Scott McNealy, and Jobs wasn't involved in it. Gates wasn't involved in it, but a lot like uh, Kapoor had created Lotus 123. McNealy was Sun Microsystems. So it did have some heavy players, but not the top guys in the telecommunications revolution. But it was a pretty interesting conference.
there's a fascinating and related example. This is from a paper that Keeley published in 2021. But he talks about the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was a federal agency. It was set up during the Cold War because there was concern we were losing the space race to the Soviets, which of course, looking back, we know was false because it was such an economic basket case. Um, but this agency was set up to develop practical applications for technology like space and these kind of things that were going to keep us current with the Soviets. Now, the government audited ARPA in 1969. And what they found is that the researchers, instead of studying these kind of practical applications, they were just doing basic pure science that wasn't going anywhere. And so Congress stripped their funding for that kind of research, and they were chastised. There was one particular congressman who led that effort, and he was blasted for being anti-science. And you're gonna doom our
Proxmire, perhaps
what's that?
Senator Proxmire.
No,
Proxima.
Mansfield, I believe was his
Oh,
name.
Mansfield. All right.
Yeah. I'll find his name in a second. Mansfield is his last name, but he led this effort to strip funding. So what happened is all of these ARPA scientists were unemployed, and they went to Xerox PARC and they developed major technical developments. So they developed the graphical user interface like Windows, pop-up menus, the trash can, the little trash can icon, the laser printer, so and this helpfully supports his crowding out thesis.
Mouse.
Yeah, 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 his crowding out thesis, right? So the government was paying these guys to, tinker in a lab without realizing that they weren't doing anything useful. And so after that, they go into the private sector and they develop very useful technology. So it sort of goes back to that point I was making, namely that you can't point to things that are publicly funded and go, they wouldn't exist otherwise. You can't know that because in many examples, we see that when the public funding goes away, the private sector fills the gap in important ways.
Yeah, expanding on that, if you recall, you mentioned the multipliers that the proponents use about how every dollar the government spends is respent and respent and respent. But the other opposite side of that is every dollar that the government takes is a dollar that's not used in industry and not used by the suppliers and not used by the employees and so forth. The same multiplier operates both directions, so it's a moot point, but frequently used, and you see it all the time in government programs. They talk about how this is going to create so many jobs, but they don't talk about how many jobs are being displaced by all of that.
I also think the Austrian school analysis of central banking is really helpful here because oftentimes what the government does is it screws with the interest rate in order to stimulate economic development. And so what it does is it sends false signals about investment. And so this is the source ultimately of economic booms and busts. And you can read F.A. Hayek's work on this, or even Ludwig von Mises, where they talk all about this, right? So the government interfering in the economy in this way sets in motion a chain of events that leads to an economic collapse. And then when that happens in like 2008, for example, everyone goes, "Oh my gosh, we need massive public stimulus to get us out of this ditch." And a lot of the Austrian guys whose work I appreciate, they look at this and they go, "Well, look, you just did that, you did that 5 years ago, and look where this led, or 10 years ago, and look where this led." So I think you're right.
Didn't Friedman argue similarly? Not to denigrate anything from the Austrian school, but the Chicago school, the old Chicago school, was more along those same lines uh, than they were Keynesian, if I got my facts straight.
I think Friedman's point was a little different. I believe he was
It was different.
yeah, he was in favor of central banking. I think his point was that they just did a bad job of managing inflation. Like if they tinkered with it a little bit better, then they could have prevented the Great Depression. So it's a slightly different
I
approach,
hadn't
but
heard that. Okay.
yeah.
Cameron,
Oh,
I read your piece last April and it surprised me. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression that you thought that private funding could ultimately replace government funding. And so I was wondering whether in this presentation you were going to give us maybe a pie chart. Have you ever seen a pie chart showing the amounts, the relative amounts of government versus private funding of research in America?
Let me get the figures for you. I have them handy
Well, let
here.
me give you some figures for just two small institutions, my own, the
Mhm.
University of California, San Diego, and then we have an outfit here right on the periphery called the Salk Institute of Biological Studies. Now, the last report of UCSD was that they're at 1.73 billion in total extramural funding. That puts them seventh in the world. If you take into account that we are a relatively smaller university than some of the other top seven, we rank one, either first, second, or third, depending on how you look at the numbers. The amount of federal funding is just under 90% of that total. And the agencies in rank are NIH first, National Science Foundation second, NASA third, that surprised me, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, And in sixth position, the great state of California, which we know is a bankrupt state, but yet they're number 6 in government funding. Now, you might say that since we're a relatively young university and we haven't developed private fundraising as much as, say, Stanford or UCLA, which is the truth, let's look at another institution, the Salk Institute. And I consulted with their immediate past director of development, and she spent her entire career nurturing private funding for Salk and did a very good job. Nonetheless, they're at about 75-25, 75% dependent on federal funding. So my first point is, what is the reality of thinking that we could ever get to the point where private funding could replace federal fundings? That's my first point. The second point is, yes, you cite a lot of flaws in research, and they have existed for centuries. But where is the evidence that private funding would solve the fraud problem? I've had both government funding in my research and private funding, and the accountability measures for the government sources were much greater than they were from the private money. And you cited yourself fraud in both government funding research, and then you cited the Theranos example. There's a private source. So how is private funding ever going to be able to replace government funding, and how does that solve the problem of fraud? By the way, from a historical standpoint, I think you're much more accurate in saying that the 1940s was the beginning of the explosion of government funding. Going back to the 19th century, I don't think counts. I don't think citing the Industrial Revolution supports your argument nearly as well. Remember, in those days, there was no distinction between astrology and astronomy, whereas in the 20th century, we were much more advanced. The explosion in funding was during the Second World War, when there was a realization that it was research that won that war. The Office of Naval Research was formed. That created our Scripps Oceanographic Institute here. One of the reasons UCSD always ranks high is we've got this great, big, huge oceanographic institute that brings in $302 million. They have projects all over the world. That's never going to be replaced by private money. So those are just a few points, and if I talk any longer, I'm going to start coughing. So I'll let you
The Scripps
respond to
thing,
that.
the Scripps thing at
Yeah, those
USD, that originally was funded by Scripps, though, wasn't it? Hence its name.
Yes. Yes.
So the initial impetus for its creation was actually private sector, not government.
That was in 1902 with the creation of a Marine Biological Institute, which was actually created by a full-time faculty member at the University of California.
But funded by
And
But
funded by
Ellen Browning Scripps came along and gave them a few $1,000,000.
yeah.
But
Vanderbilt
Roger
did this-
Revelle, who was a commissioned naval officer, came from Scripps to Washington to create the Office of Naval Research in 1943.
Vanderbilt did
And
the same thing in one of the sons of the Vanderbilts up in New York in Southport, or was it Northport? But the problem was his funds were limited, so he decided it was more important to preserve his estate, and so he donated all of his money to the local government to take care of his estate and all the different oceanographic things he had discovered, which are on display free at the estate because it's all paid for by his endowment.
looking at the bigger picture, maybe the reverse point of view. I don't know quite how you would, but think of it the other way around. Possibly that government research has replaced private research to a large extent because they have the power of forcing that. That is, doing things that people don't want by pure outright force. Now, it may be terribly inefficient, but they still can get it done because they have the power of force. That is, they take the taxpayer's money whether the taxpayer likes it or not.
Let me, if I may, address Jack's questions, which are great. I think this is the kind of pushback that's really helpful. I'm going to share my screen once again with you all. This is from the National Science Foundation. Can you see the screen before I go? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. National Science Foundation. This is the total R&D budget collectively for the United States for 2022, which are the most recent figures. If you look at that highlighted portion at the bottom, of the 892 billion total, the business sector funded 673 billion and the federal government 164 billion. And if you look at the chart down here, you notice that non-federal government funding, higher education, and federal government funding are these tiny little contributions going all the way back to 1953. They do increase over the decades, but if you look here, you see that it's business and NGO funding that drives scientific research. And I'll give you the link to this if you want to look into it further. But the only point I would make here in response to Jack's comments is that the bulk of the funding that goes into scientific research right now, as things stand, is almost entirely, not entirely, but almost coming from the private sector. I think what that illustrates is that businesses and philanthropies, as I said, understand the value of investing in science. And we saw this all through the 20th century and in the 19th century. Maybe you can explain why you think that's not relevant, but I think those examples are perfectly relevant because they illustrate that when there's alternative funding sources, they will support science. Norman Borlaug's work is another example. He did have some public funding, but there were major institutions like Rockefeller was one. There were other foundations that supported his work. As I said during the presentation, the Rockefellers.
Jonas Salk's was mostly private.
Yeah, and I mean even today, like you mentioned oceanographic work. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, right down the road from me, relatively, they get hundreds of millions of dollars from the Packard Foundation.
Which started it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean their board is mostly made up of Packard officials, and that has maybe some of its own challenges that need to be discussed at a separate point. But my point is that you have major foundations that contribute billions of dollars to all sorts of scientific work. Same thing with the mRNA vaccines. It was Caitlin Calico is the woman's name, but she couldn't get grant money for decades, and then ultimately pharma financed the work. And now everyone takes credit for every little public aspect of that, but I don't want to belabor that point. The other question, and correct me if there's something else you wanted me to address, but I think the problem that we have is it's not going to be a dollar for dollar replacement because, as I said, a lot of the public funding goes to garbage, right? It goes to, these are serious examples. I quoted one study in the article that I wrote in April. It was about eco decolonial queer theory, and I'm not even sure what the hell that is, but in the social sciences, the federal government funds all kinds of absurd studies. There's research advocating for children having access to internet pornography. there's studies saying, we need to subsidize the cost of heroin to drug users because harm reduction is what's going to keep them alive. So you have to go to work and pay your taxes so we can give heroin to homeless people in the name of public health. Like those kinds of things are purely absurd. And they very likely wouldn't exist without the political pressure that drives them forward, right? And as I said, and I think as the Theranos example illustrates, right? Elizabeth Holmes broke the law and defrauded her investors, and she went to federal prison for it. The researcher at National Institutes of Aging, he's not in prison, probably won't go to prison. He will probably suffer some reputational damage, and he might lose his job. I actually don't know the status of that. But you can see how the incentives work. And and the other thing I wanted to say. So when it comes to clinical research funded by the pharmaceutical industry, as you all probably well know, you have to adhere to good laboratory practices when you're doing these kind of clinical trials. Like anything you're going to submit to the FDA, you better cross every T and dot every I, because if you miss the mark, your drug's not gonna be approved. It's just not gonna be. Um, eh,
Go ahead.
you're gonna say something, Tom?
Well, I had a friend
Yeah.
who invested
Anyways,
heavily
I
um, in a drug that gave lung cancer people about 6 to 9 months of additional life. Um, During the stage 3 trials, which the FDA was involved in, the FDA screwed up and said that he would have to redo the stage 3 trials or phase 3 trials, which would have cost him another $240 million. He said he's not going to get that much out of it. So he didn't bother with continuing to do the phase 3 over again. And it was the government that screwed up, not him. And so he's the one that had to pay for it because all that money had been put into the research to begin with. He lost about $600 million.
well, I mean, everyone's got that laying around.
Cameron, you get no argument from me when you talk about waste. And of course, we have right in our own group Henry Miller, who knows exactly how the FDA wastes time and money. But one of the things that Doge revealed that several of my colleagues here at UCSD were in total agreement with, even though they might be absolutely aggressively anti-Trump, was the revelation that the indirect costs of federal grants now nationwide average 63%. Now, back when I was actively seeking grants, it was 29%, and we thought that that was high. And yet, there is Mr. Gates and his foundation. They will not pay any more than 10% for overhead, and nobody turns down Gates' money. So, I do expect out of Doge related activities for those indirect cost percentages to come down significantly.
The Better Business Bureau's philanthropic division says that an organization should not spend more than 30 to 35% of its budget on both administration and fundraising costs. The rest should be on programs.
Well, I just like to point out that overheads are neither just administration or fundraising. They the grant will pay for your test, but the overheads basically cover the cost of running the laboratory or keeping the lights on.
But that's
So,
program. But that's
I-
program, Nigel. That's program. That gets counted as program, not administrative costs. Ha
Well,
Having the laboratory
um,
there is a program expense. That's not an administrative.
yes, but no, that's right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
who pays for it? They're
That's
basically
part of the program.
overhead.
That's part of the program.
The
So
overheads pay for it. Just you don't get a grant for it.
no,
Um,
when
I
you
don't think that's the waste that Cameron is talking about.
no.
I'm with Jack that the 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 mistaken the mistakes made are mistakes made on both in private and I look at the number of experiments that I ran, and I probably ran 10 experiments to come up with one that made sense. It's and this mine were very private. That was that was for my benefit, and yet I had failures right and left. You look at how Edison operated. He did the same thing. It talking about waste is not now talking about a program that makes no sense to start with. That's a different story, and maybe that's what Cameron's talking about.
yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of comments from the from where I work. I'm in a little psychiatric research group that has a lot of federal funds, and it also runs drug studies, so it has pharma funds. And I agree that the pharmaceutical drug companies were the best supervised and monitored of any studies. I think they were very well done. But the people in this institute, they're doing a lot of studies on new treatments for psychiatric illnesses, particularly brain stimulation ones, transcranial direct current or magnetic or peculiar things, infrared. And these are all funded by the government, and I don't think any industry is going to fund them,
Government's
basically.
funding research
The
outside the
industry's
box.
making machines, but they don't fund the studies because they can sell the machines without any studies being done. And so, and I think it seems to be very good research being done. And I don't think it's frivolous. And I would also like to say, as a regular peer reviewer, I've done it very conscientiously, and I think most people do. Of course, you can find examples where it hasn't worked, but anyway, that's just a view from it.
Yeah, they're all great insights, and I think one point that I would stress that I tried to develop when in response to Jack's comment was that a lot of this good work will continue. So for example, when a company goes bankrupt, the products that they make don't just disappear. The skills that their employees have don't evaporate, right? What happens is the resources are redistributed, right? Some other company
good
comes
point.
in and buys up what's left, or their talent, right? Their engineering talent or their scientific talent is purchased away by other competing firms, you know. So the point in this case would be, the good work that's supported by the public sector right now, it wouldn't just disappear, and I tried to provide enough examples to illustrate that. That when there's value in something, people recognize it and they want to accrue it, right? When a pharma company sees that there's a viable vaccine candidate, it doesn't go, well, that's not going to make us any money this quarter, so never mind, right? They buy the rights to it and they develop it, usually over the course of 10 to 15 years, and an investment of like 3 to 500 million dollars, maybe more in some cases. So if anything illustrates the long-term focus of a lot of industry, it's developments in biomedicine and biotechnology. I think that's an important point. Um, the other thing about consequences, I mean, we have a very ferocious court system and a very extensive body of law that punishes corporations for their misdeeds. I mean, if you look at the litigation around glyphosate right now, I mean, Bayer is battling these and they're trying to get the Supreme Court to step in so they don't have to fight these because there's a risk of the company going bankrupt, not because their product is defective and it harms people, but because the tort system is so vicious that
Yes.
they're going to run out of money at some point fighting this litigation.
Exactly.
Same thing with Talc. Johnson Johnson is trying to do this divisional merger so they don't go bankrupt over these lawsuits. I mean, we all know, I hope we all know, talc doesn't cause ovarian cancer. There's no asbestos in the talc that ends up in the products, and the baby powder that people use. I mean, that's just so utterly absurd. So the point I'm making here is that corporations get punished even when they don't do anything wrong, right? That's how rigorous and how stringent the rules are for them. But nothing comparable exists for the public sector. I mean, if you look at the different cases of fraud, I think the biggest consequence you can look at is someone losing their university position or maybe losing their medical license to practice if they're caught in fraud. But there's no jail time for people that do the equivalent of what Elizabeth Holmes did at Theranos, right? So in
Great.
other words, there's consequences in the private sector that don't exist. It's not that the fraud is going to evaporate to the point that I think Jack made, but there are incentives in place that will reduce it, I think is what I was trying to say.
I find it regrettable that the general public attitude nowadays against the pharmaceutical industry is so very negative. The pejorative big pharma is seen in the newspapers all the time, and it all derives from how misleading they are in why drugs cost what they do in the United States. Nowhere, even in the Wall Street Journal, will they anymore highlight the fact that our drugs are costly because of the overwhelming cost of getting them through the FDA and the legal consequences that you cite. I am alive today, 25 years after bypass surgery, solely because of miracle drugs. So you'll never hear me say anything bad about big pharma, but the public attitude toward pharma is such that I do think it impacts the effectiveness of their willingness to do research.
I
Henry Miller
totally
is
agree.
actually,
Now, my question is why? Where does
What
that come from?
the attitude, the anti-pharma attitude,
Yes.
it comes from the trial bar collaborating with environmental
Yeah,
NGOs. They get substantial donations, sometimes from the investment world. There's
yeah,
litigation finance, which is a whole nother story. But
Oh,
right.
yes, yes.
yeah, there's these shark investors, right? They charge absurd interest rates to loan money to law firms that file thousands of, you know, product liability cases against J&J and Bayer and these different firms, and they're banking on these class action settlements. So there's a whole business that's built around profiting off of unjustified litigation. There's a whole network of NGOs that are deliberately using the court system to try to get rid of fossil fuels and pesticides and
Mhm.
plastics. Um, and the whole and they're very deliberate about this. If you go look at the work of a historian named Naomi Oreskes, who's just a shameful excuse for an academic researcher, they'll just deliberately say they will say, we are going to sue these companies into bankruptcy. We're going to force them to settle. We're going to destroy their reputations with the public, which is the anti-pharma sentiment that is so popular now. That was done deliberately because they want to get rid of the whole they want to get rid of the sort of mixed market kind of capitalism that we have, and they're not shy about this. If you read Naomi Oreskes' work, she talks about her anti-capitalist sentiments, and that's fine, she's entitled to those, but she's deliberately doing work that's harming the public, that's harming the public health. It's destroying good companies. It's leaving people who have jobs doing important research or, different kinds of support work within the pharmaceutical world unemployed. It's destruction of resources that harms people. So I deeply dislike her. In case you were
Alas,
curious.
a graduate of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography
Oh,
before she
really?
moved on to other fields.
Oh, my.
Yeah, my understanding, she's a historian of science. She wrote that book, Merchants
Yeah,
of Doubt, and they did a companion
yeah.
documentary a few years later. But she's
A very rigid thinker.
just
I,
hopefully dishonest is the
yeah.
way I would put it. I find her, anyways, that's a
No, but the
side note.
bad reputation that the drug industry has also derives from people picking up their prescription at the counter too. So there's a better way to explain drug costs than they've engaged in, and the fact that the drug costs 1/10 as much in Bangladesh is meaningless. If the drug company didn't distribute their drug to Bangladesh, they would be accused of being cruel to humanity. They do that on a humanitarian basis, but it's more costly here because we drive the costs up in the approval
Well,
process.
but some of that is also due to the fact that the US puts restrictions on how long a pharmaceutical can so-called last. Um,
Mhm.
Josh Bloom's written several articles about how the the expiration date for pharmaceuticals is
Yeah.
actually really
But
skewed
that fits
improperly.
right in with what Jack's saying because
Yeah.
that's an FDA. That
Right. So
delay.
the FDA says, okay, this drug, when it's produced, it can only be sold in the United States for 1 year, and then that's it. Well, the drug companies then they know it's still good for another 10 years because it's a solid drug. It's not a liquid or anything like that. It's not going to break down. So they take that and sell it to Bangladesh and they sell it to these
Sure.
other nations. And that's part of the reason why the prices are so low because the drug companies already got a zero loss on it or zero gain on it because they had to write it off because it's been sitting in their warehouse because we didn't need it as much in America as we thought we would. So it goes over to those countries and they can sell it for pennies and still make money.
Tom, I gave Josh some more data yesterday. I call him my shelf life guru. And I said, Josh, I discovered 3 days ago that a 2-year-old bottle of Phenergan and codeine on my shelf still packs a wallop against my cough. So let's hear it for codeine and Phenergan.
You know, they banned codeine
It
cough
lasts,
syrup.
it lasts a long time.
They
As
banned
long as it
codeine
doesn't
cough
have
syrup.
Tylenol in it, it's okay.
Anyway, we do have to go to a hard break here and end. We're actually way over the hour. Luckily, I set it up for an hour and a half, so we still have a couple of more minutes. But any parting words you'd like to have, Cameron?
Just thank you for your time and for listening and for the constructive pushback. That's always helpful. A lot of people just called me stupid and evil. So thanks for the dialogue. I appreciate it.
Yeah, as
Well,
as
thank you.
Yeah.
the,
It's
the
very
participants in these things,
stimulating.
participants in these things really asked some really good questions, and I really am glad you
Yes.
guys could participate. So thanks everybody for participating, and look forward to the next one. Take care.
See you
All
later.
right.
Bye.